Gender role stereotypes and biases. So this is actually a really good follow-up topic, which is probably why it's the next chapter in the book. How we have internalized some of our socialization and our expectation of what gender should or should not be for individuals. For this chapter, we're going to be talking a little bit about stereotypes. I highly doubt anybody has not heard of the word stereotype. There are stereotypes that are beyond gender. Obviously, gender is not the only notion that provokes stereotyping of people or to be stereotyped. Ethnicity, race, where you're from, even what state you're at. So Texans definitely have some stereotypes. As you know, I am from the Midwest, so I'm Chicago, and later in life moved to Iowa. But for Texans, there's definitely some stereotypes of Texans that some of which I was aware, such as like that Western, like everyone wears boots in Texas, the howdy, the y'all, everybody says those things apparently, again according to the stereotypes. But one of them that I was not aware of was this thing with Whataburger. So I knew Whataburger existed before I moved to Texas, but I did not know it was so duly protected and honored as a Texan. So if you would have showed me this 4 years ago, I would not have understood it. But today, because I've been in Texas for about 3.5 years, I totally understand it. So again, the more prominent one, the Western, the howdies, that's also another Texas stereotype, that people in Texas are ranchers or cowboys and things like that. So stereotyping, again, is something that we all do. We use it, it's basically a cognitive shortcut of how we categorize things, and we literally categorize. So I'm going to take a moment to explain again why it's important for us to think about intersectional perspectives. If I was not teaching intersectionally, we would just be talking about gender, which we will be for the majority of this lecture, just contrasting kind of the femininity, masculinity. But it's important to really look at stereotypes and just research in general that addresses people, in this case, even if it's just looking at gender, intersectionally, because we do have different stereotypes that are basically gender times something else. If I say, for example, the word, woman, there are stereotypes of women, what women do, what women don't do. Women like nails, women caregive. Now, if I say the word Muslim, maybe some images are coming to your head. Might be, maybe you're thinking of a man, maybe you're thinking of 9/11, or maybe you're thinking about a lot of things. Now, if I say Muslim women, though, maybe you might be thinking of this, like a lady in a hijab. So this, again, is going to provoke some stereotypes. Now, we're not just looking at this lady as a woman. We're not like, oh, she's carrying this and that. But you can't ignore the fact that she has a hijab, and that depending on your experience, depending on some of your knowledge, that you're going to associate some aspects of what that means. Now, it's not even just the woman times the religious, or this hijab attire thing here. It's also going to be contextual. So for example, if I show you this picture here of this fashion blogger who happens to be also Muslim, you might pay attention to her hijab, but you're probably paying attention to other things. So maybe some of the assumptions, stereotyping might be a little bit different. We're trying to dissect, again, stereotypes and how different factors of a person will pull on certain stereotypes, and will also kind of clash with other stereotypes, and sometimes making it hard for us to categorize people, which is actually a pretty good thing, because most of us do not necessarily fit a perfect box. And in general, when it comes to people, there's not a lot of use for too many stereotypes. Some of them are pretty okay, but then there's also a whole slew of evidence of how stereotypes can really be negative factors in people's experiences. So the last image here we go. So here we have, again, another woman, but again, she has a hijab on her head, and if you can see, you're probably paying attention to maybe her fencing sword and her American flag mask there. So here I have a bunch of things going on, right? You've got the American flag, which is probably putting up some stereotypes. She's obviously an athlete. This is a sport. You got the fencing. What does that mean? You know, I usually associate that with like maybe potentially people who are a little bit more wealthy, since it's kind of not a very common sport. And then I've got the hijab on her, and she's also black. And sometimes when people think about Muslim individuals, they forget that a pretty big population of them are also black. So here we have like all these little stimulus factors kind of interacting, having a harder time really putting her into a box than if it was just a woman and I'd tell you to put her in a box, or if it was just someone in a hijab without all these other things. So again, this is just an example of how stereotyping is basically just kind of how we process and how we're cognitively generalizing, our attempt to generalize. And when a lot of these factors don't go into a box, those stereotypes get sort of clashed a little bit, which is actually a really good way to intervene in terms of becoming less stereotypical in our thinking and really working on our biases. So best way to work on your biases is to really expose yourselves to people. So here are some more examples of how stereotypes are very much intersectional. Again, we can think of stereotypes of men and women, this is looking at it in a very basic, non-inclusive binary approach. But then we have all these different intersections that are more based on whether the gender of the person and also the race slash ethnicity. Again, some of these might be good depending on where you're at. Black women, white women, arrogant, blonde. And obviously, again, a lot of these they're not true. You cannot predict a person's athletic ability based on their race. That doesn't work that way. You can also not predict their promiscuity based on their race. It does not work that way. There's a lot more intergroup variation than there is intragroup. So what that means is that there's a lot more similarities between these three men than there are similarities between all black men. Okay, so this is where, again, it gets important to address stereotypes and biases, especially when they become systemic and cultural, because all these things do have impact on our actions, whether they're collectively or whether they're individually. So right now we have a big Black Lives Matter, and again, part of that issue is the stereotypes related to black men, being thugs, being quick to anger, being maybe even aggressive, and how those cognitive shortcuts can potentially be problematic. All right, so in terms of gender stereotypes, usually these boil down to our beliefs on masculinity and femininity and how those may or may not relate to gender. Now, in psychology, we really took serious masculinity and femininity. There was even a point where we would actually measure how masculine or how feminine people were and then somehow attempt to use that information for their diagnostic criteria or to really understand their diagnosis. Now, today we know that that's not really a thing. Now, as I briefly mentioned, there was a time where psychologists were interested in masculinity, femininity in terms of diagnostic purposes. Now, we do still use some of the scales that address masculinity and femininity, but they're honestly very useless. And the many reports I've written, I've never actually talked about masculinity or femininity. Just to give you an idea also of how sexist psychology was, the first personality inventory, so the first assessment tool that tried to look at femininity, masculinity, actually developed this scale, which they called the masculinity, femininity scale, but it was unidimensional. So that meant that it could only be one or the other. So you were there. Actually, in order to develop these items and to address what masculinity was, so for masculinity, they asked a bunch of men, what it meant to be masculine, to be a man. And for femininity, because they did not necessarily want to use any women, they decided to go ahead and use a response of 13 homosexual men. This is again how sexist our research has been. This was developed in the early 1900s, so it hasn't even been 100 years when they were still really completely opposed to even including women in any way, shape, or form. So in terms of gender role development and kind of our idea of how gender should be, again, the very young, they understand gender and they use stereotyping, but not as much. They understand like, well, Timmy is a boy and maybe he likes blue. but they don't necessarily expect Timmy not to like to play house. So during adolescence, these gender roles become a lot more rigid. They actually become a lot more rigid even than when young adults. So during adolescence, you see a lot of, again, the dudes kind of acting like the dudes, and the girls being very much kind of acting like whatever it means to be a girl in there. Again, stereotypes do have some advantages. They help us kind of get to answers and shortcuts a lot quicker, but there is a lot of disadvantages too. And this has to do more so with the fact that stereotypes are the precursors to prejudice and discrimination. So there are consequences of gender stereotyping. For example, here's a really good Supreme Court case from this lady here in the red. Her name is Ann Hopkins, and she was actually an accountant who worked for a firm. She was very good, had all kinds of great reviews, had sort of gone up the ladder, gotten more accounts under her name, and just had done a really excellent job. Well, she petitioned to become partner of a firm, and she was actually denied. Now, this came to a big surprise for her because up until then, she felt like she was given really positive feedback and had not necessarily had any. Well, once she got denied, some of the feedback that she got was that she was seen as too bossy, too overbearing, needing to go to charm school, and some of her immediate supervisors gave her some friendly advice, and they told her that she just really needed to be a little bit more feminine, to maybe dress up a little bit more, wear a little bit more makeup, buy more jewelry. So she was literally told this as a sort of side note by some of the people who rejected her petition. So after this, she quit, and she did sue the companies, indicating that really she had been discriminated because she was a woman, so that she wouldn't have been asked or given that feedback if she were a man, and that idea of being pushy, overbearing would have been turned into being assertive and being a hard worker and critical thinker and a leader. She ended up winning the case. It was like a 6-3. So this thing that happened to Ann Hopkins is what we call the backlash effect. And that is when a person is not fitting sometimes the stereotype or the expectation, the norm, then there can be some negative consequences as a result of that. And in this case, for her, it was losing the partnership. Overall, she did win the case and went back. And so some of you might have already maybe exhibited the backlash effect. Some of it can be pretty mild and maybe even comical. Sometimes when I say that, I'm my heritage is Mexican, but then I don't really like spicy things, and I also don't like guacamole. Like people, are like, what? What is wrong with you? What kind of Mexican are you? So that is a mild version of the backlash effect. It's kind of comical. How are you not fitting the stereotype that all Mexicans like these things? Often that fear of not fitting also can trigger some people's behavior, and sometimes that is conscious or not necessarily within your control. One thing that has been noted is something called the stereotype threat. So in this case, it is when a person fears being negatively stereotyped. So basically like somebody thinking, well, they're going to think that I'm too pushy because I'm a woman instead of assertive. And because of that fear, that acknowledgement that somebody's going to stereotype or have certain expectations of you that you may or may not be able to fit or even want to fit, then that actually inhibits your performance. So the last thing that I want to talk about is sexism. So there are two types of sexisms, and there's many other isms that I will not cover, but you are responsible to go over. And that is hostile benevolent sexism. So hostile sexism is very clearly noted. We can see it everywhere. You can see it in ads, you can see it in movies, you can see it in politics. So here's a good example. So back in the day when Hillary Clinton was a contender, there was so much anti-Hillary propaganda. And again, this is not a debate of whether she was good or not, or whether it was awarded or not, but there was definitely very sexist attacks. And here is two examples of that. So we have small breast, left wing, fat thighs. This is making fun of her body. We don't really see this too much for men, and that's kind of part of the sexist kind of idea of objectifying women. Another derogatory remark against her. So it wasn't necessarily that she was being criticized as a politician, but she was being criticized as a woman politician. And that is a really clear example of how hostile sexism is really present in many aspects. Benevolent sexism is a different wing. So in this case, there are positive feelings towards women. So people might not necessarily think poorly of women, but they might still believe that there are some key things. So for example, a common benevolent sexist idea is that maybe a woman can't handle so much physical labor, or a woman can't handle so much pain. So these are the ideas behind benevolent sexism, but often what they look like is, well, let me help you with something, such as like the desire to help women, the desire to protect women. Now, some key distinctions to know between these two. So in terms of hostile sexism, it definitely decreases life satisfaction. So people who are hostily sexist, whether it's women against men, women against women, or men against women, they report decreased life satisfaction. There's also a higher tendency to believe rape myths, so that's the idea that rape victims somehow are at fault partially or entirely for the rape. And the last is that when this is exposed, so when people are talking about hostile sexism, that actually leads women to advocacy. So women do not like to be mistreated. Once you start address how hostile sexist certain places are, then women usually want to advocate. Now, in terms of benevolent sexism, this is very different. So in this case, it does increase life satisfaction. So people who are benevolent sexists and want to be protectors, or women who want to be protected, do report higher life satisfaction. Exposure of this is not very promoting of advocacy. So basically, when you tell a person about the underlying assumptions of benevolent sexism, they don't necessarily get too bothered by it. Now, what fosters benevolent sexism is a little bit different than hostile sexism. So benevolent sexism comes from this idea of like social order. So this idea that there's sort of a way to be in the world, again, that is very culturally promoted, that the world is just and fair, and it needs to be that way in order to function. That is a gender system justification. So people who are benevolent sexist are more likely to believe that maybe the reason that women are needing to be protected is because they take care of the kids. So there's more of a, like, the reason why this sexism inequality happens, or why we don't expect this from men, or we do expect this from women, is because it's part of the system. Likewise, people who believe gender justification systems, so they believe that, again, the roles are there for a purpose, kind of have this more traditional mentality, often believe that these roles are fair and just, so that there's no problem with these roles. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just sort of like a way of looking at the world, and how that way of looking at the world promotes benevolent sexism. Now, this gender justification system is not understood or benefit the same by men and women. It's actually a little bit different. So what we have here is, I mentioned hostile sexism directly is negatively correlated to life satisfaction. Does that mean that it causes it? No. It's just related in some way, shape, or form. Now, in this case, benevolent sexism, when we look at how that relates to life satisfaction, it is positively correlated, but only for men. Okay, so for men who believe that that women should be protected, they actually report a higher life satisfaction. It is not significant for women. So women's belief system of whether men should hold the door or not is not necessarily related to life satisfaction. So it doesn't matter whether they believe it or not. There's no relationship there. If individuals, though, do believe that the system of how our gender works is justified and it's fair and it's there for a purpose, then that's when both men and women who believe in benevolent sexism increase their life satisfaction. So basically, it kind of fits this gendered system. So basically, only when benevolent sexism is explained through gender-specific justification system, so it's explained that men hold doors for women because women need to be protected, that is when both men and women report higher life satisfaction. This is the mediator. That is specifically what this variable is called, that it's specifically the mediator for women. more so than for men. For men, there is a direct connection between their belief system and life satisfaction, but for women, it's only when they explain their benevolent sexism beliefs through the gender justification system that they report higher life satisfaction. So all in all, it appears that benevolent sexism is positive, but since it's really rooted in the belief of less competence, it continues to be an issue, especially when we look at status and different power dynamics and how the power dynamics between men and women still continue to have a large gap. You can just look at our government to see, or leadership positions, the top 500 CEO positions. The great majority of those are all men. Alright, so I'm going to end with this video, which is, I think, a very enduring video that talks about gender bias and stereotypes. And be sure to complete all the tasks for this week and review all the material.
As a girl, I'm expected to be your little princess. As a boy, I'm expected to be your hero. I'm supposed to play with dolls and look pretty. I'm supposed to play sports and act tough. Crying makes people think I'm hormonal. Crying makes people think I'm weak. If I spend more time at work than at home, I lack devotion. If I spend more time at home than at work, I lack devotion. People will question my sexuality if I choose to join the army. People will question my sexuality if I choose to be a nurse. I'm expected to define myself as a boy or as a girl.